Okay, thank you, Anne. And I was actually very pleased to notice as the day progressed that a number of people had titles that were different on their slide compared to what's in the program. I've actually got one that's different on the program compared to some other bit of paper that we've got in our papers. So obviously the right title got in there somewhere. And thank you very much for inviting me. And it's been a very interesting day. I've learned a lot over the course of the day. As my title suggests, this talk is going to be quite a bit more circumscribed than some of the overviews that you've heard recently. I'm only going to be really talking about one study, the Australian longitudinal study of aging that has been going on in Adelaide, and I'll tell you a little about that study in just a moment when I get this to work. Didn't you say the left one?
No, left click.
You did that. Oh well, hopefully it'll work after this. Familiar face to some of you, the Australian, I think we've missed a slide. Oh well, never mind. The Australian longitudinal study of aging was begun in, okay, now we're going back to the first slide. Thank you. The other speakers that you've heard have presented some of the general issues concerning the use of medications, also addictions, other drugs, different aspects of pharmacy and side effects of various medications, opioid use, etc. What I'm going to talk about today is really a snapshot of a local population, that is the ALSA sample, and look at how they have used medications. I won't be talking really about alcohol or other forms of addictions. In general, we didn't see any evidence of that in our sample, and that's one reason why I can't talk about them. So what I will be talking about are the use of prescription, over-the-counter, and complementary and alternative medications, and I'll also look at some of the implications of a particular form or class of medication use and how they have an impact on falls and fractures. So as I started to say, Gary Andrews may be a familiar face to you. He began the longitudinal study of aging in the early 90s, and our first round of data collection began in 1992. I inherited the study from him, and he unexpectedly died in 2006 and also took on the directorship of the Centre for Aging Studies. The Australian Longitudinal Study of Aging, which I'll refer to as ALSA from now on, is a population-based panel of older adults living both in the community and in residential aged care. And it was designed to look at the complexity of normative aging, aging as it typically presents, which is somewhat of an oxymoron because we all know that as we get older, we tend to become more and more unlike each other. So what is normative, really? We're all different. At baseline, we had 2,087 older adults, which included 565 couples, and they ranged in age from 65 to 103. 88% of them were either Australian or UK born, so it's by linguistically a fairly homogeneous sample of native English speakers. By wave 13 in 2014, that sample had dwindled to about 94 active participants, slightly more alive. But in January of last year, which was our most recent death data, 86% of the sample had died. So in a way, I'm giving you somewhat of a historical view of what's gone on in Adelaide. This slide just simply is here to show you the overall structure of the study and the fact that we had two different primary modes of data collection. All of them involved the participant being in their own home, but on some of the occasions, shown in blue here, we interviewed them face-to-face, and on other occasions, they were interviewed over the telephone. And on the occasions when we interviewed them face-to-face, that's when we gathered the data on their use of different forms of medication. The method that we used was largely quantitative, and that's the only data that I'm going to be talking about today. And it was, as I said, collected in a home interview, but that was also followed 2 weeks later, if participants were interested, in a clinical assessment, which looked at their physical functioning and also their neuropsychological or cognitive functioning. They also were given some questionnaires to complete in their own time, which they then returned to us. And as I said, we saw all of the people in their own home. This just puts a human face on the data that I'm going to be talking about. One of our participants on 3 different occasions over the course of 10 years in the study. no, more than 10 years, nearly 20 years in this study. Okay, so in terms of the medication use data, at the first 6th and 9th wave, and also at the last wave, the 13th wave, we asked people to present all their drug containers, also to tell us why they took the medication and how long they'd been taking the medication and so forth. We did take some pictures of medications, but we didn't take them all together. We took pictures of individual medications, so I can't show you a glorious picture like the one that Craig showed with all those multiple medications. At wave 3, we did something which was methodologically probably unsound, but it was done at the instigation of the main investigators to save a little bit of time, and we simply asked people to tell us if there'd been any changes in their medications. Now, this was 2 years down the track, so A, those data may not have been as reliable as the ones gained at the first wave, and B, there may have been some tendency to omit some of the medications that they were no longer taking. They may not have told us which ones came off the list, but only added new ones. From wave 7 onward, we were also able to get information from the PBS so that we could have an objective indicator of actual medication use, and we could compare that to their self-reports. Unfortunately, that tended to confirm the self-reported data, so we were quite pleased about that. But the mixture of methods is somewhat of a mixed blessing in terms of how comparable the data are across all of these big waves of studies, the study. And if you've been involved at all in longitudinal research, this is a common problem that besets it. Conceptually, we took a biopsychosocial approach. I mentioned that we were interested in doing a study of the complexity of normative aging, because aging occurs across a very wide range of different dimensions. And what we wanted to do, and we've done it to some extent in certainly in the third element of my talk, we tried to look at specific relationships amongst variables that were of primary interest, but in the context of, or taking consideration of, or controlling for other dimensions of functioning. And I'll give you an example of that later. But, so the biopsychosocial approach, from a psychological point of view, we measured people's mood, their affect, cognition, and also their morale. Those are the main areas that we looked at. In terms of their social functioning, we looked at their networks, their marital status, and their living arrangements and so forth. We also looked at their functional abilities in terms of how mobile they were, whether they were still driving, had they fallen or had any other accidents and so forth. But it's really the bio side of the equation that we're mainly looking at today. And here, I guess the most fundamental, from an epidemiological point of view, question that was asked was simply for people to rate their health in relation to other people and to people of different age and how their health compared to the way it was, say, 2 years earlier. We also then did look at medication use, which I'll come to in a moment, but the other big area had to do with taking a chronology of their history of medical conditions or their different morbidities. So at baseline, we found that the most common morbidity, and this won't surprise you, it's come up today, was arthritis, followed by cardiovascular disease, hypertension, gastrointestinal disease, and what were classified as mental health problems, some of which, instead of being self-reported, as all the others were deemed to be present if based on depression scores. So that's a slightly different way in which that data was gathered. Most of these morbidities were comorbidities. It was very rare for someone to have only a single illness in our sample. And we used these data to answer the question about mortality 14 years later. And what we found was that there was an increase of 25% in mortality outcomes for people who were taking 3 or 4 medications compared to those who were taking none. And an even higher risk associated with it was 1.8, so an 80% greater likelihood of death amongst those who are taking 5 or more, or who had 5 or more chronic conditions. And I present this mainly because in showing you these data on chronic conditions, and then showing you the different outcomes in terms of survival, what we're really getting at is perhaps a hint of also polypharmacy, in that people who have more chronic conditions are also likely to be on a greater number of medications. So those curves could possibly be seen to give us some intimation of the adverse consequences of polypharmacy. I'm not saying that there's a one-to-one correspondence by any means, but just to give you an indication objectively of poor outcomes associated with what is intended to be in the participants' best interest. So we haven't actually done that study, so that's a bit of a limitation. So as I wanted to just say that the topics I'm going to be covering are the baseline overview of medication use, look over time at changes in the use of over-the-counter and complementary and alternative forms of medication, and look at the use of psychotropic drugs and how that impacts on falls and fractures, which again is a topic that's been discussed at a broader level today. So at the start of the study, roughly 90% of the participants were taking at least one medication, but on average they were taking 3. And a quarter of the sample were taking at least 5 medications. So the sample was, the target younger age range of the sample was 70. So these are probably not surprising statistics. About a third of the sample were using both non-prescription and prescription combinations, and 20% of the sample were exclusively reliant on prescription medication. The anatomical chemical therapeutic classification system developed by the WHO was used to classify the medications that were being used in order, in relation to the organ or system for which they were prescribed, or the organ or system on which they had their effect. And I just wanted to mention 3 of those classes of medications. The C is the first part of the coding system referring to cardiovascular system medications, N for nervous system, and A for alimentary or digestive tract and metabolism. And at wave 1, and these 3 categories I'm highlighting because at baseline, those were the categories that were amongst the top 10 medications that were prescribed. And as you can see here, the vast majority of these medications are actually for the cardiovascular system. So they're being treated for cardiovascular disease. Now, this is just a very small subset of the overall pattern of medications used at baseline. And bear in mind that here we're talking about pattern of drug usage or medication use in 1992. So with aging, we do see an increase in polypharmacy. We see an increasing number of comorbid conditions, and we also see a range of physiological changes and changes in the brain, which you've been spoken to about earlier in the day. All of these things taken together can increase the risk of adverse drug reactions, hospital admissions, as we've seen, and other adverse drug-related outcomes. So, in addition to prescribed medications, which I've just shown you very briefly a snapshot of, I wanted to also look at the use of over-the-counter and complementary and alternative medications in older adults, because this is an area that's been relatively understudied, particularly in Australia, but it's also not been looked at in a longitudinal way. And we looked at these over 4 of the different waves of the ALSA study. Oops. Before showing you the results, basically covered this. So, as you know, over-the-counter medicines include anything from antacids to antihistamines, analgesics, laxatives, that sort of thing. Complementary and alternative medications, herbal supplements, traditional or Chinese medicines, and so forth. And it's estimated that about a third to half of people over the age of 60 report using one or the other of these classes of medicines. And we'll see that in ALSA, there was somewhat less use, but nevertheless, quite a number of people did use these medications over the 4 waves. And I'll show you the data. I forgot I had that slide in So at the beginning of the study, you can see that on the top line, the complementary or alternative complementary and alternative medications or over-the-counter medications were used by about 20% of the sample. And there's no obvious temporal pattern in the way that changes over time. It tends to go up and down. By wave 7, about 35% were using one or the other of these medicines. And you can see also the results for over-the-counter medications alone. Again, it tends to go up and down, ranging between overall, if we look at all three categories, so here's the complementary and alternative medications, again, up and down, but somewhere between 10 and 35%. So we're at the lower end, at least amongst these participants, over these 4 waves of the study, so going from 1992 through 2003-04. And there's no real obvious temporal pattern. So descriptively, the other thing that we saw was that the top classes of complementary and alternative medications or over-the-counter drugs that were used are shown here. So in terms of complementary and alternative medications, vitamins, which are the palest blue, and minerals were the most frequently used, followed by herbal medicines, and then followed by nutritional supplements. And you can see here, though, there does tend to be a slight increase, although our scale isn't very huge, in the vitamins and minerals, but relatively steady use of the herbal medications, and again, a slight increase in terms of nutritional supplements. The vitamins that were mostly used were B, C, and E. The herbal medicines tended to be ginkgo biloba and other Chinese herbal medications. And the nutritional supplements mainly were fish oil or cod liver oil, or particularly in the latter part of the study, glucosamine began to be used more widely. The over-the-counter medications were primarily analgesics and laxatives, followed by antithrombotic agents, very low-dose aspirin. And again, there's somewhat of a trend upward for the use of analgesics over the course of the study, but again, a bit of a drop at wave 6. And otherwise, for the other 2 classes of drugs, apart from wave 6 here, we have a fairly steady use of the laxatives. Thank you. And the other question that we were interested in knowing an answer to is who prescribes. So we wanted to examine some demographics as to whether age, gender, and education, or income level, or self-rated health affect over-the-counter and complementary and alternative medication use. We found that for the over-the-counter drugs, there were none of these demographic variables made any difference, whereas for the complementary and alternative medications, it was women, and in particular women who were younger, who were more likely to be using those medications. And they were mainly reported to be used for just the general enhancement of their health and also for boosting the immune system. So the last part of my talk looks at psychotropic medications and falls, and I have to go through this pretty quickly because I'm down to my last 5 minutes. So here, instead of just providing some descriptive data, we want to look at some of the consequences or outcomes, and obviously having experiencing a fall becomes much more common as we get older. After the age of 65, about a third of the people over the age of 65 will experience a fall at one time or another. About a third of those falls will be accompanied by fractures, and if that happens and you end up in hospital, we often find, or the statistics show, that as many as 50% of people who experience a fracture, primarily hip fractures, are dead within 12 months. And there are different categories of risk factors for falling. We're mainly interested, or this study that we did was mainly interested in the use of certain medications. This would be considered an extrinsic factor. And the medicines that we were interested in using were the psychotropic medications. So we had close to 1,400 or 1,500 people rather in the study, and we looked at data from the first wave and the third wave, the second wave being just a short follow-up interview over the phone. And we identified people who were persistently using psychotropic medications, as shown here. That was about 22% of the sample. And we also had then another 1,100 or so who were not using these medications at either wave, close to 200 who had used them perhaps at wave 1 but not wave 3 or vice versa, and their data had to be excluded. So as you can see, it's the anxiolytics and antidepressants that are most commonly used, followed by the antipsychotics and hypnotics or sedatives. And the unique thing about this study compared to many of the other studies in the literature was not only did we look at both falls and fractures, but we also looked at the, controlled for the effects of a very wide range of possible confounding variables, which in fact were differentially associated with use or non-use of the psychotropic medication. So persistent users tended to be more often female, they tended to be slightly older, living in residential aged care. They were often reported experiencing, more often, dizziness, poor mobility, cognitive problems, arthritis, cataracts, and a history of stroke or transient ischemic attack. So in terms of the number of falls, I didn't think I had so much to talk about. In the 12 months prior to wave 3, 540 people fell, which was bang on the 33% more or less that was predicted. Many of the people who fell actually fell more than once, and this was more common for the persistent users than the non-users. So persistent users had as many as 3.5 falls on average. The main factor that tended to contribute to the risk of falling was gender, and in fact the relative risk for females was 1.77, so they were 77% more likely to fall if they used psychotropic medication than those women who didn't. There was a non-significant effect for psychotropic drug use in men. You may recall from the previous slide that more women than men used or were prescribed these medications. The other thing that modified the likelihood of falling in combination with psychotropic drug use was BMI. And what that did was to reduce the relative risk once you took into account how what someone weighed in relation to their height. We found that the risk was greatly reduced, and those who fell were more often at the extremes of the BMI, those who are underweight or obese. And we found really a very similar pattern for fractures. So just in the interest of time, I'll whiz through this and won't necessarily go through it in detail. But again, fractures were more likely to occur in the persistent users of psychoactive drugs compared to non-users. The relative risk was 2.5 times greater for women who used these medications, again, non-significant for men, and again, BMI reduced the risk of a fall. But in this case, it was only for the underweight group who were more likely, and using psychotropic drugs, who were likely to fall. So despite some group differences between users and non-users, really all we're seeing going on here, in addition to psychotropic drug use as a risk factor, is female gender and particular body mass indices. So these data confirm what has been shown in other studies, but they also extend it because we did rule out the possibility that other factors that tend to go along with being a psychoactive drug user were not contributing to this effect. But the gender difference may be possibly linked to, and we haven't followed this up totally, or at all really, increases in frailty, possibility that osteoporosis is more common in the females, and that also contributes to falling. They may also be on higher doses or have been using them for longer. So what this snapshot really reveals is that we only have given a limited amount of attention to the wealth of data that we have in the longitudinal study about medication use and how it's played out longitudinally. Part of the reason for changing the title was that we couldn't really look at the trends over time because we have the data, but we haven't looked at those data yet, and I didn't have the resources to do that in the amount of time that we had. So there's the possibility here, if you're interested in answering some burning questions, to use these data to do that. And my time is up, so I just want to give a few acknowledgments to the other members of the Center for Aging Studies, and to point out our director who's here today, Tim Windsor. And also to acknowledge Andy Gilbert from the University of South Australia, now retired, and his colleagues who really were responsible for most of the data that analysis that I have presented today, and that in turn received funding from the ARC and HNMRC as part of one of the Aging Well, Aging Productively grants. So with that, I'll close.
Thank you so much, Mary.